Good morning, everybody. Here we are. This is Pastor Brad Jagger from the church in Silver Lake. And as I mentioned before, this week was going to be a coronavirus watch week. You know, I kind of need one of those fancy graphics like the news does to scare you. You know, we're on coronavirus watch. But I had mentioned a while before that we were not opening the church for quite a while. We're taking it safe. I have been saying for a while that all evidence is pointing to a second wave, that there is more to come as we open up. All these new cases are going to come and things are going to get far worse before they get better. That is not my personal prediction. I am not a scientist, but I do listen to scientists. And when they speak and when the medical professionals speak, I listen to what they have to say. And a lot of people, sometimes seem surprised at, what's happening right now. It's like, well, you've been told this for weeks. So what's going on right now and how does it affect the church in Silver Lake? So that's what we're going to look at today. That's what we looked at yesterday. We're going to be looking at this throughout the week. I'll try to get to some other topics too. But look at the graph on the screen. So the very last line is yesterday in Ohio. These are Ohio numbers only right now. And that last line is 729 new cases in one day in Ohio. 729 new cases in one day. I was starting to sound the alarm. Well, I've been sounding the alarm for weeks and weeks now, but the kind of putting us on notice as far as possibly seeing this second peak on Thursday. And on Thursday we had a little over 700 cases. I think it was just over 700 cases. Then we had the weekend, things dipped down. 600 on Friday, a little over 600 on Friday, and then we had a little over 500 on Saturday and Sunday. And before the weekend started, I said that weekends always tend to be lower reporting days, whether that's the bureaucratic system of reporting or fewer people going to the doctors or whatever the reasons are. Weekends tend to have a little dip down. But I said, if we're over 500 on a weekend, then that would be telling. Well, both days we were over 500. Look at that line going across the graph, the lighter line, the lower one. That lower one signifies 500 cases. Look at how long it's been since we've had 500 cases. This month is this graph is a month. So, way back at the beginning of June, we had one day where we were above 500. And then we have to go back into May before we get the next day that's over 500. And here we had 2 days back to back on a weekend that were over 500, flanked by 2 days that were over 700 and 1 day that was over 600. You just look at the last few days from maybe, let's call it June 12th or so on up to today, and we see that angle going upwards. That angle is not going downward, and that angle is not even going flat. Look at the blue line I put at the top. That is 729. That is today's number. The only time we surpassed that number was almost a full month ago. So we are now hitting really 2 days in a row, or not 2 days in a row, Thursday and then today, 2 days close together, 2 days over 700. And we have not had that any time in this month. At the beginning of the month, we had 1 day over 700. So things are getting worse in Ohio. I know people get distracted and say, well, the problem now is in the South and in the West, and that is true. Those are the major epicenters. But let's not take our eyes off of Ohio. Things are getting worse in Ohio, and how worse will it get? Let's look at a longer graph here. Let's see if I had one of these. There we go. So this is going from the beginning. I try to get out of the way a little bit. The peak that you see that's really, really, really high up in April, that's at the beginning when things were getting rolling. And those few days that are extraordinarily high in Ohio have more to do with they were catching up and understanding the coronavirus, and I think that represents more a backlog of cases than 3 really bad days. So those 3 days are kind of an anomaly in the situation. So you can keep it, take it out, whatever, but just know that that's not a true 3 days of high numbers. That's 3 days of catching up on reporting. But look at that 700 line throughout the history of the coronavirus in Ohio. We're looking at 1-2 days that are above that line, around April 29th, maybe 2 days that are right at the line. And then we got that 3 or 4 days of catching up on the reporting where things kind of got extraordinarily high. All that said, things are, one could argue, worse now than they've ever been. So I will repeat that. In Ohio, the way I'm looking at it, things are worse now than they've ever been. And let's see how this week plays out. Again, maybe these numbers will go down, but maybe we're going to start hitting an 800 or a 900, which would be devastating for us here in Ohio. Things are getting worse, not better. And then when things got bad before, we shut everything down, and that's when the numbers started going down a little bit. I doubt that Ohio will re-shut things down. I think once they've opened Pandora's box, they've opened Pandora's box. I'm not saying that they won't shut it down, but I'm thinking it's going to be harder for them to shut it down a second time. The unrest from those who are against the shutdown would be even stronger. So we have a bad situation here. So there's my take on the situation. Now let's look at the church. Well, I said let's see what happens before we open the church. Well, the church is not opening anytime soon. This is devastating. You know, I was sitting back, and really the weight of it was really beginning to hit me of what this means and how to handle it. And I don't know how to handle it other than keeping closed. I mean, I know how to handle it. We're handling it. I don't know how to handle when to reopen. Things are getting worse. Now we're leaning into July, and things are getting worse. So we have to let things ride back down again before we can even have the conversation of entering back in the church. Well, July is going to turn into August. August is going to turn into September. Certainly, I'm not going to declare July over with yet. But if this week continues on this trend, I think that we'll be ready to make the declaration that nothing will happen in the church apart from an essential thing through July. So I think AA is still not meeting, but the door is open to them, because I understand that that's a kind of a double-edged sword. It's a life-threatening situation either way. There are a couple other groups using the church that there are certain ways much smaller than our church that they might be able to do what they do social distancing wise. You know, we're still in the church getting some work done, social distancing, wearing masks, sterilizing things. So some things are getting done, but other than those specific things, I don't see church happening in the building in July. I'm not going to declare that yet, but I'm warning you, we're on the way to declaring that. Then we got to look at August. It seems like I keep on saying this. Well, let's not do May, but let's look at June. Then June comes. Okay, we're not doing June. Let's look at July. And now we're getting ready to say not July. Let's look at August. And maybe in August we're saying not in August. Let's look at September. And we're not even declaring that we're coming back in September. Let's look at September. That's a devastating situation. So there's where we stand. When we do get back to church, when we get back to worship, let's talk about worship specifically. I mentioned this before, but I want to mention it again. Singing exponentially spreads the virus beyond even speaking. And we should be wearing masks. So when we are worshiping, that means there's going to be no singing for quite some time, even after we do get back to worship. Passing the offering plates is not prudent when you're trying to squelch a pandemic. That means everyone's hands are touching the plate. So we won't pass an offering plate, at least for quite some time. Communion, people sharing a common meal in close proximity to each other, is probably not prudent. So we probably won't be doing communion for quite some time after we return. We just named most of what makes up worship. I don't know if it's most, but the music is all through it. The offering time, the communion time. I mean, that's a massive part of the worship experience. So even when we do get back to worship, which isn't going to be anytime soon, then we're talking about worshiping very differently. So as things look now, I'm not going to declare anything now, but let me recap and declare what it looks like. It looks like nothing will happen in July, but I haven't made that declaration yet. If it's August, by the time things are looking good enough for us to do some church activities, I have been saying for quite some time now, our first church activities will not likely be worship, but some other activities for us to just be a community in the presence of each other at the same time. And that's not necessarily worship. And then after we do those kinds of baby step activities of just being together as a community, then we can start looking at worship. So as it looks now, and I'm not making any declarations, but I'm trying to give you as much honesty and foresight as I can. If trends continue as they are now, this is the best case scenario as I see it. The best case scenario, according to recent trends, is nothing will happen church-related in the building in July. August, best case scenario in August, we're doing some form of activity that's not necessarily worship-like, but a gathering of a community using masks and social distancing. That would be best case scenario for August, according to recent trends. And then best case scenario would be we'd begin worshiping in September, awkwardly doing a different form of worship that allows us to be safe in the worship space. This is not good news, but this is the path we seem to be on. So if anyone has any concerns about any of this, feel free to contact me. These are hard decisions. These aren't fun decisions. If anyone has any ideas of what we can do to be a community during this pandemic above what we've been doing now, I'm all ears. But as things are getting worse, those activities are probably not going to be a face-to-face activity. If we weren't doing a face-to-face activity in April and May when things were below the 700 line, then we're certainly not going to do things in August when things are above the 700 line, or in July when things are above the 700 line, just because we're sick of it and we got to get back together. We're not going to wait till it gets worse and then gather at that moment. So we will be waiting it out. Let's see what tomorrow brings. Let's see what the next day brings. Let's see what the next week brings, and we'll do our best. So with that, bearer of bad news, and these are supposed to be my uplifting morning things, but I need to address this week because this is the week I've been talking about for a month, and we need to stay focused on the coronavirus right now, just so we keep the communication lines open with the rest of the church. With that, I'll talk to you tomorrow.